Hello, beautiful people. My guest today is Blog of Jake. And Jake is an anonymous account or a semi-anonymous account who has had podcast guests on his own podcasts like Vitalik Buterin, Keith Raboy, Francis Suarez, and Blau, the musical artist, 3 Lau. And some of you guys might not know who any of those people are, understandably, but the people who do will likely be impressed because Jake just started his podcast in the last year and he has gotten these guests and he also writes. And I was attracted to his blog, and the topics he talks about include the crypto space and longevity. He's very interested in how we can live for longer periods of time, which we talked about in this conversation. And he's also interested in self-improvement. So I figured, why not invite him onto the podcast and talk about it? If you enjoyed this conversation or you didn't, let me know on Twitter. @HeyDannyMiranda is the best place to give me feedback for this episode. And now, let's get right to it.
Interesting people, thought-provoking conversations, nutrition for your brain. Journey through the minds of the world's top performers and discover what it really takes to achieve your highest version. This is the Danny Miranda Podcast.
So let's start off with the idea of something you wrote about in August of 2020, which is that you've been unemployed for 10 months, but your net worth is greater today in August of 2020 than it was when you quit your job. So break that down for us, because that sounds pretty crazy.
Yeah, it's let's see where to start. It's interesting. First of all, thanks for having me on. It's great to be on the show. You've got an awesome podcast, and fortunate to connect in front of this and now have the opportunity to come on. In terms of being unemployed for what's now, at the time it was going on a year. Now it's going on a year and a half. And when I say unemployed, it's a very particular type of unemployment too, because not to be like whatever, but like I made enough money in banking my first couple of years out of school that I don't qualify for any of this stimulus that's going on. So unemployed is like collecting $0 for me. And it's a choice. Like, I think, obviously if I wanted to get a job, it's just a matter of, where I would be willing to settle for whatever job I could get. But like, I could get a job. I, went to school and have a degree and have a resume and things like that. But, I chose to quit banking and to, pursue, whatever I wanted to do. And that's led me to at first writing and then now doing the podcast and things like that. And kind of in parallel to all of it, I try to, spend some time thinking about where my money's sitting and, whether it's working for me or, burning against me. And so actually now, I'm pretty significantly allocated towards crypto. Let's see, I could even rewind a little bit further. When I quit my job, Tesla was like worth maybe a 20th of what it is now, thereabouts. And I had just put about half of my worth, which is, not much. I'd only been out of school for 2 years, but enough to, I wouldn't want to lose it, and enough to do some damage. And so I put half of that in Tesla because I already had about maybe a sixth of it in Tesla. And it had gone down from like 280 where I had bought to like 230. So I tripled down at like 212. I remember the exact number. So I, and that was about half my money at the time. And then I sold it, unfortunately. So after I quit, I realized I wanted to like have cash so that I could, I didn't want like stocks to kill me while I was, unemployed and then have to like rush back into a job. So I thought it would be smart to sell everything and just start from scratch. So I'm traveling at the time and Tesla goes up from like 212 to like 350. And I sell, of course, almost all of it and miss the next 10x from there. So continuously kind of beat myself up over that one, but try not to stress it too much. My next good move though was taking, some of my money at some point around, maybe December or January and putting a good chunk into, and that's December 2019, January 2020, and putting it into Bitcoin and some other crypto assets as well, mostly Bitcoin though. And so those have done quite well and continue to do quite well. Like as we speak, Bitcoin's almost at all-time highs. It probably broke all-time highs in the last couple of days, around like 48,000. Ethereum, same thing. So I've been fortunate that I cut my spending, which is like another piece of the equation. It's really, I wrote about it. It's kind of hard to like verbalize, but or maybe I'm just not doing such a good job. But I cut my spending quite a bit coming out of banking when I just like really didn't have to care about what I was spending, because I was making pretty good money for like a young kid with no family or anything like that. So first thing to do is I cut my spending, and then I've just gotten lucky with the investing that Bitcoin and Ethereum and have some money in like Amazon and things as well. They've just done so well through COVID and this very weird year that I'm actually now like significantly up on where I was when I quit like a year and a half ago. So very fortunate and could talk more about investing, but that's kind of like the broad picture.
Really cool. And I want to now take us back to, I don't know, is it December 2019 when you decided to first start all this stuff online, and take us to your decision of why you started to build an online presence at all and quit your job?
Yeah. So it was December 2019. I quit in September, traveled for a bit, got back. I was watching a Jets game. I'm a big Jets fan, unfortunately. And well, fortunately, they've been bad enough the last few years that I don't even have to watch after like a few weeks in. I'm not that big of a Jets fan to torture myself with all that. But they were losing to an undefeated Bengals team. I think it was like week 8 or week 11 or something. Probably week 11 is December, and I had this idea. I was reading Fred Wilson from Union Square Ventures. He had a blog, and I was kind of taking an interest in VC at the time, venture capital, and I was digging into his blog and a few others, and he writes like every day or every weekday, and so it kind of gave me the idea that I might be interested in doing the same. I had a lot of ideas and things that I wanted to write down, and had done some writing in the past, but never in like a blog format. And the Jets were getting killed, and I was like, well, what if I just write, if I skip the fourth quarter and instead write my first blog post about why I'm writing my first blog post because the Jets are getting killed in the fourth quarter. And that's basically what I did. And then I committed to writing every weekday for the next, indefinitely. And then that ended up being like several months. So it was a great experience, and writing on a schedule, I produced so much more than I otherwise would have if I was like writing, just when I wanted to. So it was a really, I like writing. I learn a lot from it. And I feel that I do have some perspective that's, maybe not the most valuable thing that someone can read, but certainly I think more valuable than a lot of like garbage that floats around. So, hopefully some of it was useful for some people, and I got some positive feedback, and haven't been doing quite as much writing lately, but it was a great way to start in terms of like the creation.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because I started my blog in March of 2020 with the intention of just 2 posts a week for however long. I thought it was going to be a year. It ended up being, I think, like 6 months until I started the podcast. But then you start a podcast. So what was the reason for that? What made you say to yourself, oh, I'm going to add to the infinite amount of podcasts in the world? And what made you realize that was your next medium?
Yeah, it's funny, like looking back at your journey. I think there's a lot of parallels between us, not only in kind of the mediums, but in the message as well. And maybe you're a little bit more leaning on like the self-improvement, and I might be a little bit more leaning on some of the technology type of stuff. Yep. But generally, I think we both meet in the middle on both of those things and have interest in both of those things. So in terms of the change of medium from writing to podcasting, I think, with writing, first of all, I'd kind of drained the tank a little bit after like 6-7 months of doing this every weekday. It was, it's a lot of writing, and you actually never really, or at least I didn't really run out of ideas. I would kind of store them in like a note, and then if I didn't have one for the given day, I'd go to there and pick one out. And I have at least like one idea, and it can be like a pretty small thing, but can expand into a blog post. So it's not really the ideas that are the problem, but it's like you start kind of wanting to do something else, or at least I did. And it's hard for me to, just like how it was hard in banking to kind of figure out what I wanted to do next. It was hard with a committed schedule of the writing, and I was also on like a pretty committed running schedule at the time. And like between those two things, it was actually one of the reasons I didn't really start working out until maybe like last year. I've had bursts over time, but I always thought of exercise as like, this is gonna be a little bit of a tangent, I guess, but I always thought of exercise as like, it was something like where if I went to the gym, I felt pretty good about it. And that's obviously great. And like, it's a healthy thing to do and everything, but it actually, took away a little bit from like my fire to do other things, because I like felt satisfied. And so that was part of like in college, for example, I had to do like classes and things. And then there was like a social element obviously as well. And like, so I would just like skip out on the gym. I was like, I don't have time for the gym. Like if I want to, spend some time doing this, and the other thing, like I don't have time to get satisfaction from the gym. And it's like kind of stupid and backwards, but the same thing was happening with running. Like I was actually, I was like really happy, like with like running a lot and writing a lot. Like it's a very simple way of life, and it was very nice, but it wasn't sustainable in terms of there's simple thing. I'm 26 years old. Like at some point, I can't be done making money right now. Right. So I needed to like figure out a way to make money, and otherwise I would have to kind of, run that until it was over and then get a job again. And I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to figure out a way to have, sustainable financial freedom. Not that I don't have to do anything, but that I can only do things that I like to do. And the podcast to me represented a way to do that, where writing kind of didn't. And I know you can do like Substack with like, paid tiers and things like that, but it's important to me as well to be able to provide the content to everyone. And I think it's actually, it's not just totally altruistic. It's kind of infeasible to try to like create paid tiers and things when you're just starting out, because you kind of need the audience before you can even do that anyway. So the podcast to me was something I've been thinking about for like, I don't know, at least a couple of years. And I've always been good at like reaching out to people and getting a hold of people that I wanted to get a hold of. And it just seemed like kind of a natural thing. I got a great first guest, and it was kind of off to the races.
So on that topic of reaching out to people, what are some of the ways you think about reaching out to someone who's, let's say, above your level, and you're not even posting and showing your name? So a lot of people would look at that and say, oh, that's going to stop me. But you just said to yourself, well, I don't care about that. Or talk to us through that, about that process of reaching out to people.
Yeah. So there's a few things to kind of maybe touch on there. I mean, fundamentally, my strategy is a cold email strategy. And obviously, you can like DM people as well, but I'm very comfortable with the cold email, and it's hard to get comfortable with like rejection and non-responders, but as comfortable as someone could be with that, I would say I probably am. And so, and people actually, you'll learn, like, if anyone listening, like you cold email someone, I hope people don't go and, annoy people like crazy after you're listening to this. But if you reach out to people and they don't get back to you, they don't care about, like, and you reach out to them a second time then, right? And like, say they still don't get back to you. You're not like annoying them. Like, they don't care. They like literally couldn't care less about you. And so, they're just going to like delete it, and they'll just like keep deleting it. You hear stories about, I don't know if I could come up with one at the top of my mind, but like there's several stories of like successful entrepreneurs and people alike who like, reached out like 30 times before getting like a certain job or whatever, and just like refused to take no for an answer. And I haven't, I don't think I've ever really gone further than like 3 attempts on something, but people don't actually really get annoyed like you would think they do. They actually, I think, start to gain some respect. And
100%.
yeah, and they respond to persistence. And so like the way that I realized this was when I was in banking. There's like a very common thing in like the banking recruiting process where like you find people's emails, you do the cold email thing. And so I was on the emailer side when I was recruiting, but then when I was in banking, I was getting these emails from college kids, excuse me. And I think what I realized was like I would respond to people more often if they had reached out twice, especially if they reached out once, didn't get a response, and then reached out a second time with like a very simple like, hey, like not sure if you saw the last email, but would really like to talk to you in particular for XYZ reason, and like keep it really short. And so I think it boils down for me to like just being like nice and brief and persistent. And maybe there's like a few other factors in there, but that was all good for me and has worked relatively well thus far. And we could talk about like the pseudonymity thing too, but I don't think I was really, I was pretty confident that I could get good guests, and the thing I needed to prove myself was that I could actually like produce a good podcast as well.
Okay, so let's go into the producing a good podcast. What makes a good podcast for you, all things considered?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer, but I think I'll take a stab at it. I think one element for sure is I guess candor and like realness and whatever the reasons why I think Joe Rogan resonates with a lot of people is whatever the kind of word is or group of words is that I'm trying to like get out. And it's like it's so different from a Fox News or a CNBC or a New York Times interview. It's just two people talking about interesting things and having a conversation. I think that at its core is kind of, for me at least, kind of the minimum. And then secondarily, the subject of the conversation needs to be, aligned with the interests of the audience. And so to some extent, it may be tougher to have kind of a generalist podcast, which although I may get kind of placed in a niche, my ambition is to be more generalist or at least be interesting to a wide variety of people, because I'm taking certain subject matter and having it discussed in plain enough English that it's interesting to everyone, from like a computer science student at like MIT to like my mother. And so I think the style of the conversation is important. But then there's a number of things that I think about as the host, and like we could talk about this, I'm sure, all day, but the different elements that go into it. And for me, I think one of the biggest elements is the balance between preparation and spontaneity. Yeah. And they're not mutually exclusive, but the more you're prepared, the more you kind of want to get to certain points and drive the conversation in certain directions. And the less you're prepared, the more you kind of have to go with things. And so it's a balance that's it's definitely been challenging, but I think that's kind of like the beauty of the art.
It's so crazy because what you're just talking about is something that I dealt with when I had an interview where I felt like I was so prepared. I had so many questions prepared. I was like, oh, this is going to go amazing. I know this person so well. And what happened was I just leaned on the questions as opposed to having a conversation. So, and sometimes when I prepare less, it's like you have a better conversation because you're so lost in the moment. Have you also found that to be the case?
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually, maybe in parallel to like that dynamic is another one where it's really the same thing, but when there's like a balance between being in your head thinking of what, and this must be somewhat of a trip, like hosting a podcast right now and talking about this, but being in your head, like thinking of like, where am I going to drive next? Because I take that like pretty seriously as the host. Like, I'm having a guest on. I don't want to have them like be in a position where like they don't know what to say, or like they feel like they have to drive things because that's not what they signed up for, really.
Mm-hmm.
And, I want to be able to open up their best insights kind of and make it very easy for them. So there's an element, like, it's not for nothing that like we prepare and we kind of try to drive the conversation in interesting directions and things. But there's also something to be said for not kind of planning at all, or, maybe doing a game plan. This was something that what's his name? Bill Walsh, in his book, The Score Takes Care of Itself, talks about. He would like plan rigorously and create this game plan for the football game. And then I think he says like, when, during the national anthem, he kind of like forgets about all of it. And obviously he has it, still in his mind, and he doesn't lose the preparation that he did, but he's not like obsessing over it. And he's making the best decisions in the given scenarios. And I think there's something to be said for that in podcasting, like focusing less on where you're going and being in your own head, and more so, just being totally, encapsulated in what the other person's saying, and like totally listening and just responding genuinely with, with how you want to respond. And the tricky thing is like, you may not get to 20% of the topics that you kind of want to cover if you do that, but there is like a nice flow about it. And it does, I agree with what you said. Like, I have had situations where I've prepared less and the conversation feels like it went better.
Yeah. The Score Takes Care of Itself by Bill Walsh is an incredible book. I highly recommend it. And I think something that I think about often is like preparing for the first drive or preparing for the first few questions, let's say. And then, like you said, just forgetting it. I think that's a very beneficial way of going about it. And, it's a constant art. We're just getting started, right? Like I don't know how many episodes you're in, but like 70 episodes for me, you're, 50, right? So it's like, it's a constant process of getting better at the art, and you only get better at it by doing it. So
yeah, I definitely agree. And like you said, I think we're both very early still. I don't know. It's an interest, like with my writing, right? Like I started and I was doing it every weekday for several months, and didn't really have like I didn't set out to do that for several months. I set out to do it kind of in perpetuity and then see what happens. And that's kind of like the same way that I am with the podcast right now. And so I don't know, like for sure, as much as I'd love to say like I'm in it for the long haul, I'll be doing this for the next 5 years. I don't know. Maybe it's difficulty with committing to things or something like that. But I like to change things up, and especially when it comes to like how I structure my days and structure my weeks. And currently, they're at least to some degree structured around podcasting, just like in the past they were structured around writing and running. And we only have one go at this thing, so I like to experiment with different chapters and try different things. But right now, I'm definitely having a ton of fun with the podcast. It's just so beneficial for so many reasons for me. And then not to mention, there's a number of people who are kind of, a growing number of people, I guess, who are continually like reaching out and saying that they're really enjoying it, which is great. So it's great right now. And I think I'll at least be going forward with it and refining the art, hopefully for the foreseeable future.
Very nice. And so switching gears here and talking about the other platform that you're big on, which is Twitter. How did you decide Twitter was going to be your avenue as opposed to Instagram or TikTok or whatever it may be?
Yeah, dude, I'm so mixed on Twitter in terms of like my impression of it. I've been aware of it for several years, obviously, but wasn't meaningfully involved until I made this current account that I have like a year ago, and I wasn't actually really doing with it other than like doing anything with it other than like reposting my blog posts until, I don't know, 4 months ago, like about the same time I started the podcast, probably 4 or 5 months ago. And I think, a quick pros and cons sheet, like on the pros side, it's nice because it's very similar to the types of ideas I would jot down for my blog posts. The only difference is, like when I was talking about my notes earlier, the only difference is I don't write a blog post about it. It's a note, and I kind of, maybe I refine it a little bit, and then it's a tweet, and then it's done and it's off. On the other hand, so on the one hand, it's nice because like the idea generation and like synthesis and clarity and brevity and all of that, it helps to train you, I think, in that way a little bit. The negative maybe on that point specifically is that as people, trying to grow, well, I'll speak for myself as someone trying to, grow my following a bit, hopefully not at the expense of like quality, but expanding like a quality following and people who really enjoy what I'm doing for what it is, and hopefully aren't just following me for like some GameStop Bitcoin tweet that went viral, which is something that happened. But there's like something in the back of your head, regardless, I think, that's like trying to twist things here and there for making it like more, engaging and like just more like tweetable and everything like that. And I think sometimes that comes at the expense of like the actual sincerity and like purity of the idea sometimes. So it's a little bit of like a sacrifice maybe, but generally I think it's overall good for that purpose. And I think it's really good for learning as well. Like the people you can follow and consume their thinking in real time is something like you can't wait for these people to write a book every 4 years. Or you could, but you'd miss everything in between. And so the thing I like about Twitter and podcasts as well, for that matter, is like you can keep up to date with the smartest people in the world who you want to follow. And that's really cool to me. The negative side is like, it's definitely a balance. Like if you spend too much time, and I actually don't follow anyone mostly because it's just like too distracting for me. So I have a couple of lists where I see some things from some people, but it's like a real dopamine machine, and it's hard to put down. So I think for me, like, I don't know, I'm still playing with it a little bit, but what I would like to do is kind of have an outlet where I can generate tweets or like save tweets without getting like sucked into the app too much. And I think it's great for that. But and it's great for the learning, like I said, but kind of in doses. What are your thoughts, if I can flip it on you a little bit? Like, what are your thoughts on Twitter as a medium or like as a social network and everything like that?
I've been on it on and off since 2009, and I believe it's the fastest way we can get information in the modern day and age. And you see that where people on Twitter were able to see COVID happening way before it actually happened. And you saw that when Osama bin Laden got killed, Twitter was the first place for the news before media, before anything. So I think there's something in Twitter where the smartest people come to it because the ideas spread the fastest. And written and reading is the fastest way we can consume information currently. If you think about this audiobook or this podcast rather, and a video, like if you were to read it, it would be faster, most likely. And Twitter forces you to condense thoughts in such a way. I'm very bullish on it. But like you said, I understand the downsides and the dopamine. And so what I do to prevent that is I make sure to have my feed on most recent, as opposed to the algorithmic feed, which is so good that gives you what you want and will sort it by the best tweets. So I think recent, that's one little hack and it was, the Twitter feed was recent for a long time, sorted by most recent tweets, but then they changed it to get people more hooked. I don't know if you could do that with lists. I don't know how lists work exactly because I don't use them. But what are some of the lists that you follow? Is it like crypto? Is it technology? What type of list do you subscribe to that you make?
Yeah, I'll answer the question on lists, but I want to circle back quickly on the Twitter thing because I think you bring up an awesome point. Twitter was how I began to be aware of COVID. I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned like I joined in January, but I wasn't really using it and posting and things very much. I was just using it for blog posts and stuff, but I was consuming a lot. This is how I discovered like a whole group of people that I thought, that I now still think are some of the smartest individuals in the world, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's, technology type stuff or, um, you know, like self-improvement type stuff. Those are kind of the two buckets I would say of sorts of people that I tend to follow. Um, and so, I was living in New York and, my friends didn't care, didn't see they just didn't even know COVID was, they saw it on CNN maybe, but like it wasn't a thing by any means. And meanwhile, I'm reading this stuff on Twitter from Balaji and other people. And I'm like, this is, and at this point, I wasn't like super early, but at the point when it was like in Italy and tearing through
Mm-hmm.
Italy and even
Yep.
in San Francisco and tearing through San Francisco and Seattle, and we're in New York thinking it's all going to be fine. I was like, this is at least going to be like what's going on in Seattle and San Francisco. 2 months later, New York is the hottest spot in the world for COVID. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was like crazy to see how I could be ahead of that just by following the right people and having like a reasonable perspective of like understanding probabilities and things like that. So it's definitely, you could argue that, and I think, like I said, this applies in listening to podcasts as well. I think listening to podcasts and following people on Twitter, the right people, you can almost operate in a world that's a little bit ahead of the masses,
Yep.
which is pretty interesting to me. Like living in the future, I think enables you to better see, anyone can see maybe 3 months ahead of where they are. And so if you can live in the future by 18 months, then you can see you can see 21 months into the future where other people can only see, 3 or whatever it is. And that's like a very loose model or whatever, but I think there is value to, at least for people like me. I like to kind of try to see forward and bring people with me if I can. And
Yeah.
hopefully I'm a little bit right on some things and maybe I'm totally wrong, but COVID was one of those things. The other thing I wanted to mention was, I might have given like a little bit of a biased negative review of Twitter just because it was kind of on my mind, but the amazing, like, I don't want to take anything away from how absolutely amazing it is. There's people who reach out to me from like India,
Mm-hmm.
who came across my content and are now listening to my podcast regularly or whatever. And like my blog, the same thing immediately, very quickly before I have like a large number of followers, I have a large number of countries from which people are reading my blog or listening to my podcast. And so I found it absolutely amazing how global it is and just how it can serve as like a magnet for all of these kind of interesting people, like you said, people who may have a certain inkling for like, uh, you know, being in that kind of information sphere to then be able to find me and connect with me. And likewise, I can find others. So it's definitely incredible. It's just imperfect and everything is. So don't mean to take anything away from it in that light.
On the topic of being 3 months ahead and on being Twitter, how Twitter and podcasts could be 3 months ahead of the rest of the world. Think about how important that is in a world that's constantly changing and constantly moving. And that's what your podcast does and blog. It seems like you're just trying to stay 3 months or a year or 5 years ahead of the world so that you could have a better understanding of where it's going. So you can then help people inform about what is the future. And so what have you found? Talk to us about some of the insights that you've gained from thinking about where the world is going.
Yeah, it's an interesting question for me to answer and to be direct. I took some time and this was maybe I don't even remember when this was at this point, but sometime in 2020, I took the time to like sit down and try to think of like, okay, take it for granted that like everyone has a purpose, which is totally debatable, but like, let's say I have a purpose. What would that purpose be? And what I came up with was something along the lines of like to understand how the world works and what the future holds, and to communicate that understanding through writing and conversation, and to invest my time and money in ways that can make the world a better place. And so now I think at the time I wasn't podcasting, I was writing. But actually the first part of that is very well accomplished with the blogging and the tweeting and the podcasting. And the second part, I'm trying to invest my time well now, but I don't really have the money yet. And part of it is like investing in my time in ways that can make the money to later, invest in ways that can make the world a better place. But I bring that up because it is a big part of, who I am and what I do. For whatever reason, it's hard to like, you get deep enough into like asking why, it's hard to answer the next one. But I think I just have some drive to try to understand not just the future, like also, like I mentioned, like how the world works in the present, like how things just work, just generally, and like what people are like and things like that, maybe psychology and philosophy type stuff, but then also what the future holds and where we're going, and trying to kind of spread my thoughts, because I think I just I consider myself like a pretty reasonable person, and with enough good information, I can kind of make decent judgments and at least like set probabilities, and that's how, not to like toot my own horn or whatever, but like I was the first one in my group, and like on Twitter, it's very common, like people knew about COVID and stuff, but in the physical world, like none of my friends saw COVID coming. Like none of my friends were invested in Bitcoin. These are things where like, and Tesla was a little bit different, but also like called that shot pretty well. Like, and you don't have to call like every shot, obviously, but it helps to get the one big one right 3 months in advance, especially to your point, in a world where things are moving so quickly. And so some of the things that like I'm paying attention to now, one is crypto. I think I've used this comparison a lot. Like, you and I, we were more or less born with the internet, I think. But for those who were able to kind of, be in the working world or whatever when the internet was coming up, I think crypto reminds people of the internet in like the 90s, where it's just so early still. And you never would have known in in the 90s that like a search engine and an online bookstore and a Harvard Facebook would end up being like the big companies, but that's what happened. And so with crypto right now, like people see Bitcoin and that's kind of digital gold, and it's people think that's going to be the big one, and I don't really disagree necessarily. Certainly, of all the existing cryptocurrency, I'd say that has the best probability of remaining the largest for the longest period of time. But I think there's also use cases that may or may not emerge. Similarly, like how things came out of the internet, where crypto just really changes things in quite a fundamental way. And so I'm paying attention to what's going on there, but trying not to get lost in like some of the stuff that might be hot, like, online pet stores in the early internet. So that's one thing. Trying to think. So I mean, I don't need to think too hard. I just need to think about like how I'm going to dive into these things. The other one is longevity. I've done a couple podcasts with people who are into this, and by longevity, just to be clear, I mean the idea that we can live substantially longer lives, substantially healthier lives for longer periods of time. So like, not just lifespan, but health span. People don't appreciate that up until relatively recently in history of humans, and I don't know like the stats off the top of my head, but basically like the average human lifespan was closer to like in the 30s or 40s. And that wasn't because people weren't living past 40, but a lot of people were dying young. A lot of people were dying kind of all throughout life from various infectious diseases and things. And then we kind of did a lot of good work against, science against, infectious diseases and child morbidity and things. And now the average, lifespan is closer to, it's in the 70s or 80s or whatever. And so it's already been the case that we've extended human health span quite a bit. And I don't see any reason that needs to stop. And people question whether we can kind of, they're like, okay, we hit child morbidity and infectious diseases, but can we actually extend the maximum? And I don't see any, I haven't heard any compelling reason why we can't. And the specific way that people are suggesting that I find compelling that we can do that is by attacking aging itself. And so, you can listen to, like, I did a podcast with Aubrey de Grey. I did another one recently with a lesser known guy who's like our age named Jack Harley, does an awesome job laying out the science. But I actually don't think it's improbable to say that you and I could live to 150 years old and, be fit like we're in our 40s or 50s. And that sounds absolutely insane. But and I'm not saying it's guaranteed by any means, but, what, 10% chance or 5% chance or 25% chance? And it's like, well, where do you put that? And then the second question is like, is there any way to impact that? And I'm not a scientist, but I can maybe help raise awareness for it a little bit. And maybe someone who hears me can then take it and run with it and raise awareness in like a much larger way. And so that's an example of like where and then, that leads to more awareness, which leads to more funding, which leads to more progress. And then maybe it increases our probability from like 5 to 8%. And like, that's a pretty cool thing to have an impact on, right? So these are kind of parts of the things that drive me. And like crypto is more, relatable right now, but the longevity thing is something that I'm also really excited about.
The longevity thing is something that I think I haven't spent much time thinking about, but it really is such an important thing. If you think about it from the perspective of like, we take it for granted, like, oh, I'm going to get 80 years on life and on planet Earth. And, our great grandparents weren't thinking that, most likely. So it's really interesting. And for people who haven't really dived into that topic, where do you recommend starting?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned, a couple of podcasts on my thing are good. Aubrey and Jack Harley. I did one with a woman named Maria, who's a good scientist in the space as well. Outside of my podcast, there's obviously great resources as well. I just try to bring it to a very plain English level, kind of like I do with, or try to do with all guests. But other places to go that are relatively understandable and good fundamental places to start. I think one is Laura Deming, Deming, has a document online called something, I think it's like Longevity FAQ, and that's really good. That's kind of where I got into it to start. David Sinclair is a well-known scientist from Harvard who has kind of been one of the more respected voices to acknowledge that this is like legit. And he wrote a book last year called Lifespan. So that's another good place to start.
How many emails have you sent him?
3.
That's what I expected.
Yeah. So, he's gotten back to me and the timing hasn't worked out yet, but I'll be able to get him on. But yeah, at least 3 or 4. So
looking forward to that one.
Yeah. He's at the top of my list for he and Laura, for people who I would love to have on to talk with, but Aubrey also deserves a tremendous amount of credit. He was actually my first episode. And at the time, I'd been weighing this idea of having a podcast, but it was actually me sending an email to Aubrey asking if he would come on and him responding yes. That was like, all right, I guess we're doing it. So I didn't, it wasn't like I'm starting a podcast, let's go get guests. It was like, I'm gonna reach out to Aubrey, see if he would come on and do a podcast. And then like he said yes, and I went for it. And he deserves a lot of credit. He wrote a book in 2007 called Ending Aging, and was talking about it for, maybe the decade prior to that in terms of, talking about aging and how we could take an engineering approach to try to slow and maybe even reverse it. And the only reason I don't recommend that book to start is because it's more, it's denser, it's more science and things like that. But I've read it and I like that book as well. And I'm not like a dense reading scientist by any means. You talked about how reading is quicker than listening earlier, and I think that's true for a lot of people. I'm not 100% sure that's true for me. But yeah, Aubrey's great, and he's been talking about this, like I said, for like a couple of decades, where other scientists have been like, that's crazy, and even the people who do kind of give it some credit are afraid to like talk about it because it sounds so crazy. But you talk about it in terms of probabilities, and you kind of explain the rationale, and I think it's hard. It's not like I'm like, I'm not necessarily planning for like 150-year life, but I'm sort of planning for a life of, that's much more, has much more unknowns than most people are, I think. And so like, it comes back to very practical things, right? Like, so people put a certain amount of their paychecks into retirement accounts. And I'm like, all right, so you get that when you're 60. That's 35 years from now or so for me. So that's, 2050, right? And so I'm like, what is the
world going to look like?
Exactly. It's like, I don't know how, I don't know what it's going to look like. And maybe it's going to look similar to what it is now, but like, I don't really care about my retirement account. And that's just like me. I was like, I want all my money now. I want to invest it. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't have been able to invest it in things like crypto, and maybe everything will crash and like I'll look like an idiot. But I also like was able to, I have a buddy who's like into real estate. I was able to buy a property with him, which is like a much safer, more reasonable and traditional investment. And that returns probably better than like the retirement fund would. So that's just like one example, but it's like retirement is like, I don't know, some of these old school traditional kind of rules. I think it's interesting. Like when I was, I guess for most of my life, I've taken like a very, like you tell me something, like I want to go against it. Like I want to do the opposite. Like I have a lot of trouble like conforming to things, but I've realized that there's actually a lot of value to a lot of the ways that things work, and they operate that way for certain reasons. And it's like certain traditions and rituals, they make a lot of sense and they're for good reason, but it's important to identify the ones that don't, and like break apart in the few areas that you identify that don't make sense to you, if you have conviction in them. And so I probably lean too far on that side, honestly, but I'm always kind of looking for things that don't make a lot of sense. And like the traditional career for me is one of those things. I'm a big, like another one is like, I'm a big believer in the gap year. So before doing what I'm doing now, I had taken a gap year after my freshman year of college. And I realized, like, I look at people like athletes or entertainers who are like drowning in their own fame and things. And I'm like, take a year off. Like, you have so much money. You can come, like if you're Justin Bieber, you can disappear for a year and the press might go crazy or whatever, but like you can just come back after, like, your whole history doesn't go away. Maybe a little bit harder for an athlete because like you're dependent on your body and physical shape and stuff, but a year is not going to kill you. And it's so ingrained that like you go to college, you graduate college, you work from 9 to 5 for 40 years. And then, if you're fortunate and you've done well and your retirement account worked out, like you retire. And that's just like not for me personally. And for certain people, it's fine if that works for you. And I don't think and either is like better or worse, but just realizing, the things that are for you, and then trying to direct yourself in reasonable ways, and hopefully ways that are not like, if the risk doesn't work out, you're totally screwed. I don't know. I've tried to kind of self-direct in good directions.
On the topic of people who are famous taking a step away, have you read Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey any chance?
No, I listened to his podcast about it with I forget, Tim Ferriss, I think it was.
Yeah, so he mentions that what happened to him was basically overnight he became this celebrity. And what he did was exactly what you're talking about. He went away to a retreat by himself and figured out who he really was, because all these people were saying I love you, and how could he even know, like he doesn't even know them, and now everyone wants him to be in the movie. So he just said, okay, that's great and all. I'm going to take a step away for a second, figure out who I am, and regroup and recalibrate. And it's exactly what you're talking about. You're like, take a gap year of life. And you embody that in so many ways. And something I also want to touch on is the fact that you lean into the best life is the one you can't predict. And this is, I feel so related to you in this way, because really, like, the best things happen when you are just so surprised by the outcome. And a traditional path, personally, it just doesn't suit me, because the surprises along the way are few and far between. And so you mentioned in a different podcast the Alan Watts quote, like, if you could dream up any life, you'd want to start with making it as easy as possible, but then you throw twists in there, and you make it a little more complex, and you'd go down that rabbit hole. So talk to me about that quote that you mentioned in a different podcast, because I was just like really struck by it, and thought, wow, this is really similar to how I want to live too.
Yeah, I love that quote. I was so happy when it came up on the other podcast and I was able to share it and try to like summarize it in my own words. And I'll do it quickly here as well, because it's just like, what are we all doing here, right? We have some desires that we're trying to fulfill. And like one of them, regardless of kind of how you might term it specifically, is like, living the right way or the best way or a happiest way, or whatever your kind of priorities are. It's just like how to live, right? And so I like this Alan Watts video a lot. It's very short. It's called like The Dream of Life or something like that. And it talks about how if you could dream a 70-year life or an 80-year life, or maybe soon a 150-year life, and make it whatever you want to make it, the first time through, you would, me personally, like I would be like an NBA player, and then maybe an NBA coach, and then I would write books and like record movies and open a restaurant and be worth $1 billion and all of this, and have kids and live a super healthy life and have grandkids and everything like that, and throw like winning the lottery in there or something like that. The second time through, I'd be like, man, that was a blast, and I would do it again. And then the third and the fourth time, you keep going, and you start to be like, all right, like I know what's around this corner. Actually, I want to try something else, and you start throwing in surprises. And so Alan Watts' whole thing is like, after a certain number of runs, you're just increasing the surprises, and eventually you're getting to something that's very much like what we have in actual life, which is you can't design it up front, and you can't plan it, or like totally add in all of these ideal things all along the way. You have to have this spontaneous run. And so his argument is basically like, maybe that's, if you could live 1,000 times, maybe what we have is what you would choose in the long run. And you can kind of appreciate it a little bit more that way. And it's also easier for me then to say something like banking, or really anything that's like a pretty foreseeable like career track. It's much easier to look at that and be like, I just had 999 runs of what it's like to go through banking and get super rich and like, go on vacation wherever I want and all that. I actually want to try, adding in some surprises this time. So I'm going to quit. And like, that's a much more, I like, who knows if that's true or any of this, but the hypothesis of like, if you could dream any life you wanted to dream, and you could then do it 1,000 times, you might end up with what we have now, is very intriguing to me. And I tend to kind of believe if that was something that was available to me, that would be true. And it enables me to embrace the spontaneity and the surprise. And I think live in a bit of a better way for myself because of it. So that's kind of like what the quote means to me personally.
I love it, man. And I'm going to definitely link that in the show notes because I'm super curious about watching that and internalizing it. And it kind of goes to the theme and the idea of like some sort of connection between all people and this idea that we're all one. I don't know. That could be going down a completely different topic and rabbit hole, but
well,
yeah,
you know,
go
it's
for it.
let me just chip in there because you know it's interesting. It's actually in the same video, and it wasn't as big of a piece of it in my mind, but the way he starts it, I forget how the 2 points connect exactly, but it's a separately interesting thing to me, and maybe you've kind of connected them a little bit better. Is he brings up this topic of like stop thinking of yourself as just like random and I don't know what he says exactly, but like realize that like there's this world, right? And like we're all living in it, but like you are essential to it, right? Like this world wouldn't be what this world is without you individual, like without you. And maybe, you know, you can then run with it and it's like we're all one and all of these different things. But like at the very bottom line, end of the day, without you, like a collection of atoms or consciousness or whatever it is, like the world wouldn't be what it is. And granted, like it might mostly be what it is, like it would be pretty close, but not exactly. And so we all have sort of this impact, regardless of kind of what size it might be. And we're all essential to what is. I don't mean to make it like too philosophical or whatever, but and maybe that doesn't make sense or resonate with a lot of people. But I thought that was a separately interesting point, and it's interesting that you kind of responded to the part that resonates more with me with this other part that actually was from the same video. So again, it's called like The Dream of Life or something like that. People could look it up and you'll link it, but definitely worth a listen.
I think you're underestimating every person's significance, my man, because if you don't exist, this conversation doesn't exist. And if this conversation doesn't exist, then I don't tell my parents when they come home, hey, I had this great conversation with this guy named Jake. And if that doesn't happen, maybe they don't think about the world in a different way. And maybe that impacts the time that they go to bed and the time they go to bed. And it's a never ending cycle. And one thing leads to another. And I think you touched on the point of like, every person's impact is so important. And I just want to underscore that because it really is so true. And like just everything we do matters. And that and understanding that and internalizing that just feels right to me. Does that feel right to you as well?
To some extent. So I appreciate what you're saying completely. And like, especially the
disagree with me, my man. Go for it.
No. Well, yeah. So I'll tell you where I agree, and then I'll tell you where I don't disagree, but I have some considerations maybe. So the part I agree is like the what I'll call like what you were saying with like how you telling your parents about something and then them going to bed at a different time. I talk about like all that stuff as like the butterfly effect loosely.
Yeah.
And I am like amazed by the butterfly effect. I think it's incredible. Every single little thing. Ignore like how individual people fit into the world, but every single little thing that you do throughout your day, that everyone does throughout everyone's days, changes your entire life. And it's very difficult to know the things that, me having oatmeal versus me having eggs, like may actually not really have that many differences down the road, but like other differences that seem equally as small and insignificant can change absolutely everything. So an example of this is like, when I was in New York, I moved to New York from San Francisco. I stayed with the same group in banking. After a year, a year and a half, I moved from San Francisco to New York. And it was my first or second weekend going out, first or second weekend period. And I was going out, I met up with a couple of buddies and, and he was with like his high school group or whatever. And I went out to like all you can eat, all you can drink sushi with them. and everyone was like I showed up late because I was coming back from work or whatever, and I get there and everyone's wasted, and it was me and my buddy and another friend from school, from college, who, and this will work eventually. So another friend from college who wasn't part of the high school gang, and he also had like showed up a little late and like wasn't totally smashed. And so afterwards, he and I alone, like our buddy wasn't even fit to go out anymore, and none of the group really was. But my buddy and I were like, let's go to a couple bars. Like, we got here late, we haven't really done anything yet. We kind of signed up for a night as it was. We went out to a couple bars. We went to one bar. He was kind of having some success with some girl, and I was not having too good of a time. I was like, dude, let's get out of here. Let's go on to the next place. And so I guess, we went to this next place, and he brings the girl along. Like, long story short, I meet this girl at the next bar that I'm now, 2 years later still dating. Right. And it's
Crazy.
like, and
who
knows?
That's so crazy.
Yeah. So it's like, who knows where the future leads. Right. But at the very least, that has profoundly changed the last couple of years of my life. And that's just like, we could have just called it a night after the sushi thing. Right. And it's like such a small thing. And all of these factors just, they can turn into the most meaningful changes in people's lives. And so the butterfly effect thing, all on board, totally on board.
Okay. We got you for part one. Now what's part two?
Part two is, like kind of the everything is so meaningful. Or I don't want to like put words in your mouth, but do you remember exactly like kind of what you're saying in terms of just like everything has meaning or something along those lines?
You could misquote me. I won't take offense to it. And,
yeah. So
if you say something wrong, I'll correct it, but no hard feelings or worries.
Yeah. So there's something along the lines of like, there's meaning in everything. And I think it's not, like I said, it's not something I disagree with. It's just not something I know. I don't know that I agree with it either. It's something that I contemplate, which is kind of both extremes. It's like people say, there's meaning in everything. And then people say, nothing means anything. Nothing matters versus everything matters. And it's very hard to reconcile those perspectives in my mind, because they both kind of make sense. Like everything matters for the same, like for the kind of butterfly effect reason, kind of makes sense. And I personally believe, I choose to believe everything happens for a reason, a little bit separate, but I choose to believe it because I think it's a good thing to believe. And I don't know, some people might argue that you can kind of choose your beliefs versus like inherently believe something. But for me, it's a combination of both. And believing everything happens for a reason, either it's true and then I'm believing something that's true, or maybe it's not true. And I'm still kind of seeking to make things that happen to me that someone might consider as like happening to them, which kind of has like a negative connotation, and looking at those things as like happening for me. And like, what can I make of this situation, and how can I make this work out for the best? And it's just a very positive way to see the world, I think. And so it's something that I choose to believe because I think it's going to work out for me well, whether it's true or not, I hope. And I kind of have faith in that. The other side is kind of nothing matters. And I think it's at the same time pretty depressing, but also somewhat freeing. You can get like a lot of pressure can kind of build up in thinking that everything matters. And a lot of it can be relieved by realizing that like, and not realizing as if it's like true, but just considering the idea that actually it doesn't really matter. And so like, there's like I think of the Carl Sagan picture, the pale blue dot, and it's like the furthest picture taken of Earth from, or at least it was at the time, the furthest picture taken of Earth from, outer space. And it's like just a tiny blip in the universe. And, we're just a tiny blip within that. And this is like not a novel thing to bring up. Obviously people talk about this kind of thing all the time, but it's just like, so, and then in the spectrum of time, how little of a blip this is, but it's hard for me not to believe that like we're in a very special time. And I think that's I don't think there's anything wrong with living that way and believing that. And worst case scenario, you die and things didn't live up to your expectations. But I'd rather live, 80 years with, really optimistic, positive perspective and high expectations and be disappointed in the end than live kind of miserably along the way and be pleasantly surprised at the end, because like you're spending much more time on the journey than you are in the realization at the end or whatever it is. So I think the idea that nothing matters, I think serves a lot of people quite well. I probably tend to lean more on the side that like everything matters, but it's, I don't think either is like true or false. It's just reframing kind of how you see the world. And I think there's value on both sides.
I love how you brought that up. And I love the idea that both perspectives can be valuable dependent on what situation you find yourself in. And I think there's a great quote I love, which is not coming to me at the moment, but it's like the side of intelligence is holding two opposite things in your head at the same time and not losing your mind. And I think that's pretty much exactly what you just did. And another thing that I noticed about you is that you love to check yourself almost. Like on this other podcast that I listened to with you, you said like the internet will be around forever. And then you followed it up with like, I don't know if that was a good take or not. And you've done this in this conversation as well, where you're like constantly questioning not only your own thinking, but also my thinking. Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like, I'll be super transparent. Like earlier in this conversation, I was thinking to myself and maybe even saying aloud at certain points, like I just wasn't really feeling sharp. And I'm feeling a little sharper now. It's something where like, I think there's certain things you can do. And I know you have like a lot of really awesome practices that we talked about a little bit, off the record before this, that I think there's certain practices that you can do and certain routines that you can get in that can put yourself in a place to be sharper more of the time. And so that's something that I think about as well. And like the trade-off between habits and routines versus spontaneity, both of which I really enjoy and appreciate. And I think it all, I think a lot of things come back to a balance, and maybe that's a part of answering the question that you've asked, which is that I tend to believe that there's something between extremes in most cases. So like in politics, for example, I think politics are so silly in some, most arguments in politics are so crazy. It's like you have these two people at both extremes, and it's like you guys can compromise in the middle. Like that's obviously, either one of you can win or you can kind of compromise in the middle. And that's like simplifying things a little bit, but like it's when people think that one extreme is right with absolute certainty, and then on the other side, there's people who think that the other side's right with absolute certainty. It's like, just respect each other's difference in opinion and like listen to the other side. And so I think I play games with like considering the extremes on both sides, and I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, especially like people who grow up in like I realize I grew up, quite fortunate in, born to parent, like my dad was a doctor, my mother was a writer, and grew up East Coast United States, male, and it's in the late 1990s. It's like these are all very fortunate things in terms of time, location, parents, friends, education.
Yep.
My own, like I'm like relatively tall, like it's like these are good things that not everyone has the benefit of having and being born with, especially. And so people who grow up in more difficult circumstances, or I think parents, when you're growing up, have a lot to do with the way you kind of see the world. And certainly if not parents, the combination of parents, friends, teachers, your general school, your general community. And I don't fault people for not being able to see outside of that. I credit people for being, if they can kind of see outside of that. I think that's incredibly impressive. And so I try to consider kind of all views and just be reasonable. And I love to be, proven wrong. Like I genuinely, when I was growing up, my parents would say like, you're going to be a great lawyer one day. Cause I would always argue. And, that's partly maybe the kind of debate and consideration side, but also the rebel against authority type of thing. But the combination was basically like, I just don't like to I just like to think about things and consider different perspectives on different things. And that doesn't disclude myself. Like I have different ideas, like you kind of said. I don't know where that quote's from, but I've heard it as well. And it's very good. I think there's value to holding different ideas in your head. And like, there's one good example is, what's his name? I forget the guy's name, but Tao Te Chang, like the book, where there's all these extremes basically that he's saying are kind of like both true. And I can't like quote it off the top of my head, but that's kind of like, maybe tangential to what I'm talking about, where I think that, for example, everything matters and then like nothing matters. And it's like somewhere in the like they're both true, or like they both have value in certain scenarios or whatever it is. And so I guess I choose my beliefs very carefully. And I don't believe in that much. I have, much more doubt than I do belief, but the few things that I do have belief in and faith in, I've kind of chosen quite selectively, and I'm open to changing. But I definitely spend a lot of time like deliberating, and so writing in addition to talking was a helpful thing. But I do like kind of self-correcting aloud. I think speaking for me is as, if not more valuable than writing.
I think that people who write, read, and speak are forced to come to the truth of what they say. And they're often, when you write, at least for me, it's like when you're forced to put what you actually believe on paper and then realize that what you put down isn't that great and it might not be true in all cases. And here are the cases where it's not true. And reading as well, where you see so many different perspectives that you never previously encountered. So I think there's something about people who write and like people who meditate, people who read, people who converse often with other nuanced partners that forces some level of skepticism about everything.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason maybe I like one of the things on my negative side for Twitter is that you tend to get kind of likes for strong or engagement for strong agreement or strong disagreement. And a lot of the things that I want to say and that I kind of do say or write about are like almost hard to like because there's nothing, it's not making things easier for you. It's saying, well, this is true, but this is also true, and like deal with it. It's much easier to kind of hook on to an easy thing where it's like, work hard and you'll succeed. It's like, okay, cool. But like, work, well, what is success? And it's like, success isn't just money or, followers. Success is enjoying the ride, and work hard. You take that to the extreme, you might not enjoy the ride. So like there's nuance in everything, and Twitter doesn't allow for that in a lot of cases, I think. And, I appreciate the wisdom that can be expressed, somewhat like elegantly and with brevity, but, and I think they're nice hooks to kind of latch onto and remember. Like for me, everything happens for a reason is one of those kind of likable things, but it works for me. And so, I stick with it, but, there's a lot of things that I think are a lot more nuanced where, to your point, I think spending some time meditating or writing or speaking or kind of reflecting on when reading, there's value in like in all of those different activities and thinking about things in a little bit of like a longer form, context.
Well, this has certainly been a extremely nuanced conversation, and I'm super grateful for it. Is there anything else you'd like to add to it before we wrap it up?
I don't know. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Sometimes I have an idea of something to say at the end, but we've gotten a lot out here, and I think, like you said, it was very nuanced, and we dug into a bunch of interesting things. I'm sure I'll sit down afterwards and have a thought or two, but I think let's just end it where it was. And thank you so much, Danny, for having me on. It's been awesome talking with you about all these things, and hopefully, we'll do some more talking about these types of topics and many more in the future.
Most certainly. Where can people find you if they want more Jake in their life?
More Jake. It's everything of Jake. So Twitter is at blog of Jake. Website for the blog is blogofjake.com. And website for the podcast is podofjake.com. And all those things kind of connect to each other. And so you can see each of them from there. And if anything else comes up in the future, if you follow one or all those things, I'm sure you'll stay tuned and see it all coming.
Awesome. And those will all be in the show notes at dannymiranda.com/podcast. Thank you, Jake. Really appreciate your time. This has been a lot of fun. Appreciate you tremendously.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Danny. It was awesome being on.
That was my conversation with Blog of Jake, who also goes by Pod of Jake. And if you enjoyed this conversation or you didn't, let me know on Twitter your thoughts at Hey Danny Miranda. Looking forward to hearing from you and really appreciating you from the bottom of my heart for listening until the final seconds. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.